I am so excited to be able to share with you twice this week, if possible. I've been studying and picturing Jesus. In our modern pictures of Jesus, the images that we see that are everywhere, we see Jesus as he was, not as he is. We prefer to see him as the Lamb, Jesus in the flesh, who walked amongst us, and like John said, whom we seen and we felt and we touched. Sometimes I think we prefer this so that we can bring him to our level. But I was recently reading 2 Corinthians 5:16, and Paul said, "From now on, therefore, we regard no one according to the flesh. Even though we once regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard him this way no longer." That really struck me. We regard him this way no longer. So how should we regard him? And I think maybe that's what John on the Isle of Patmos, when he seen Jesus, it wasn't the Jesus he remembered that he had Last Supper with. It was his kingly position, his priestly as position. He had moved, like it says in Hebrews, it says, we've got to come beyond the point of our standard doctrine of what we believe. We have to move on to a more meatier word. And Paul says we can do this, that we can move on. And not that I'm not saying that we move away from the cross. I'm not saying we move away from resurrection. Those are the foundations of our belief of grace, of righteousness, of everything else. But I think we also have to come to the point where we see Jesus for who he is right now as King. In Revelation chapter 1, John says, "Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking with me. And on turning," he says, "I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like the Son of Man, clothed with a long robe and a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white like wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. And his feet were like burnished bronze refined in a furnace. And his voice, it was like the roar of many waters. And in his right hand he had 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the shining in full strength of the sun." John gets a picture of Jesus that was different than what he was used to, what he had seen all the years he had walked with him. Wearing a full-length robe, that's a priestly thing. It's a position of authority, of dignity. It talks about it, Leviticus chapter 8, I believe it is, talks about the priestly robe that they wore. And the golden sash that was on his chest, it was a priestly thing, but the priest's sash that they wore was threaded with gold. This one is pure gold. It wasn't just threaded. It shows the purity of his anointing and where he is right now. And it talks in here about his eyes being flames of fire. Now, anytime that we see fire in the scriptures, they refer to judgment. If you look at Matthew chapter 5, if you look at 2 Peter, fire and flames of fire are always referring to a judgment. And I'd really like to talk more on this, but also his feet, brazen copper. It says that it was a metal, brazen copper. It was a metal, and it was glowing like fire. And if you think about Daniel and the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had, of the large guy, I don't know what to call him right now, but the large guy, his feet were part clay and part iron, and they broke. Jesus's feet are brazen copper that were refined in fire. They're solid, they're firm, they've been tested beyond anybody else's imagination. And he came through every test, every trial, everything imaginable for us. His feet are unmovable. He had a voice like the roar of many waters. And it talks about out of his mouth came the sword, the two-edged sword. A two-edged sword, you can't handle it very well. It cuts on all ways. And that's the way his words are. You know, his eyes look deep into our souls, and the words that come out of his mouth, they cut to the very heart of man. And if we stand before him, refined by his fires, one with him, in him, realizing his righteousness made us righteous, that through grace we were saved, then he doesn't stand before us as a judge, but that refined fire just purifies us, and it makes us more like him. But what really caught me here, as I was thinking about this, is the fact that he was walking amongst the golden lampstands. The lampstands, in the Old Testament, it was the priest's duty to keep oil in the lampstands and to keep them lit so that the fires wouldn't go out. And if you correlate that with the 10 virgins who had oil in their lamps and 5 had enough and the other 5 didn't, that Jesus is walking amongst the church. He's walking amongst us, and he's trying to make sure, and I believe that's what the 7 letters were for, that our fire does not go out. He's trying to make sure that there's oil in the lamps in his church. And I believe that's what he was saying here. He was saying that he loves us, that he washed us, and that in Revelations it says that he has made us kings and priests with him. We can come boldly into his presence. And in the Old Testament, it was forbidden to walk into a king's or priest's, without permission. But through Jesus, we've been given permission to walk boldly. So he's walking amongst our lampstands, and he's putting oil in them, and he's lighting fires on them. In this season that we're about to enter, and I've been talking about this season in just about every podcast I've done, we've got to know the goodness of this season and the severity of this season, like it says in Romans. We've got to know both. And through him, through being able to stand with him and knowing that we are one with him, that we've been cleansed and made pure and made righteous, and that he is there for us. He is there walking amongst us and in the church. I think it'll be our greatest hope in the season ahead. So I just pray a blessing over you on this weekend. I pray that you all stay safe and that you keep oil in your lamps and to look to him.